So this is the finished bar of silver. Hi, this is Dan Tokar at the Willow Forge in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. My friend Steve inherited some silver flatware, spoons, forks, things like that. And he is a knife maker and thought that he could use some sterling silver bar stock and pin stock rather than the silverware. So we made a deal where in exchange for some of the silver, I would melt it down and make it into stock for guards and pins for him. So this is the finished bar of silver for guard stock. So what we have here is about 900 grams of sterling silver, 1940s vintage marked sterling spoons, knife handles, forks, things like that. All of that will fit inside this crucible. This is a clay assay crucible, which you can get quite cheaply. I like them. They don't last as long as the graphite ones, but for single use on things where you want to have a clean crucible, like with this silver, I don't want to have a contaminated crucible. So this is great. You can't use them a lot. I mean, a good graphite or silicon carbide crucible you can use 20 or 30 times. One of these, you're lucky if you can use it 3 or 4. But anyway, so I've got this. I've got my pair of tongs. I'm going to melt this silver in the forge and cast it in a mold that I made myself some years ago. This mold is just pieces of angle iron with some 1/2-inch square stock and a chunk of 1-inch square stock welded to the bottom so that it nests like that. It closes up nicely on the bottom, and this gives you flanges to clamp to hold the mold together. I also use an enameled range pan out of a stove to catch any silver that misses the mold or should escape because my aim isn't good. And because I'm doing this on the anvil so that you can see it, I'm going to clamp this through the Crucible hole, this pan, right to the anvil. Normally I would be casting something like this either held in the vise or on the floor and cover the floor with sand. So my preparation for the mold is I have cleaned it out nicely, and I take a little piece of soapstone and I coat the mold with soapstone. Some people will use other things as mold releases, but soapstone is relatively safe. And I've got lots of soapstone, so why not use it? It also helps that the mold has been used enough that it has a sort of a seasoned surface, not something that is going to easily have hot metal braze to it, because if you have a very clean mold, you can actually silver solder or braze to the surface of the mold, and then you have to cut the mold apart to get the ingot out, which is never a fun thing. So I put those two halves together. I have some clamps, welder's clamps, that I've already adjusted to be the right height to grab this. And I'll put 4 of them up. Just like that. Of course, there's always one that's a little tight. And then I have a C-clamp, which I will use as part of my safety so that the mold will not fall over, will not be tippy. In the pan. because it would be very embarrassing if the mold fell over when I was casting. Of course, that was silly of me. What I did is I just put the clamp on the wrong end of the mold. So if you think that I can't make mistakes, or that I'm unwilling to show you my mistakes, you could see right there, that was me doing something silly because I was thinking of you rather than the job. So anyway, there is the mold. The pan will catch any dribbles of silver that missed the mold, so we won't waste any silver. I have the crucible, I have a fire, I have silver. I also have my safety gear. I'm going to go get my safety gear now. What I typically wear when I'm casting is a long sleeve welder's jacket and my little Nomex hoodie, and I'll put on a pair of goggles once I get the hoodie on. This is a flame heat resistant Nomex. It's the same thing that the race car drivers wear so that you don't get burned, because if you have any moisture in the mold, you could have things explode out and rain down on you and burn you pretty bad. I'll pull that up when I'm ready. The same thing with the leather welding coat. Same thing with the leather welding coat. This is, as any of you welders are familiar, this is the welder's jacket that keeps you from getting burned up when you're welding. I always have trouble getting these things snapped up correctly. There. And I have a pair of gloves and goggles, which I'll put on when I get closer. I'm going to have to move the camera so that I've got a fire which has been cooking along for a while, so I don't want it to be hollowed out. I've got a lot of coke in there. I've got my crucible and the pair of tongs that fit it, and I put this in my fire fairly high up. I want to have a lot under it, and I want to have a lot of coke around it. So I've made a lot of coke prior putting this in here. And I'm going to surround the crucible with some coke. Oops. And just have that together there. Alright, so what I'm going to do is heat up this crucible for the first time in the fire with absolutely nothing in it. There's nothing in there at all. And the reason I do this is that it's possible that this crucible has cracks in it. Being a crucible that I've never used before, it could have been dropped, it could have been improperly made. So you temper the crucible, so to speak, by getting it hot and seeing if it cracks. Very embarrassing thing to find out if you've got $600 or $700 worth of silver in it for it to crack. All I'm going to do is bring it up to the point where the bottom of the crucible is a dull red inside. Partly what happens is the crucible will sink in the fire as the fuel under it goes away. And what you want to do is take your poker and push little bits of coke underneath the crucible. Occasionally you have to lift it up and poke under it if the fire hollows out, because you don't want the crucible to actually settle to the bottom of the fire, because then it will just be air hitting it with no heat, and you'll actually cool the bottom of the crucible off. Fortunately, sterling silver melts at a temperature which is hotter than aluminum, but below copper. It's sort of in the range that you would melt brass in. So if you've ever melted brass, you can melt sterling silver. Some very pretty little things in here. Alright, so the bottom of this crucible is beginning to get warm. I will build up some more coke around it. Alright. It looks like that crucible is actually a good crucible. So I'll take my little dipper and I'll put maybe a spoonful of borax. Just plain 20 mule team borax, the same stuff that you would normally use to flux a forge weld, goes in there. And I'll start putting pieces of silver. These were the handles off of the kitchen knives, the table knives. I had to smash them up a little bit to get them off with the steel blade. And then you have the cocktail forks. The teaspoons are actually quite pretty. This set was almost never used. It seems a shame to melt it, but it's one of those sets that, to be honest, the value is mostly in the silver. A set like this doesn't have a lot of collector's value. So Steve has more value in it to make knife guards. So I just start plopping these things in there. Once I get a little pool of silver melted in the bottom of that crucible, I'll be able to feed more of these in faster because they will melt in the pool faster than they will just sitting up like that. You don't want to overload it at the beginning. Alright, I'm going to poke the bottom of the fire to get some fuel underneath the crucible. And the fire is starting to hollow out. More food right there. Crucible will start sinking right here. There. I'm going to put the filter on the camera and see if you can see it better that way. Okay, so I've put the filter on the camera. You might be able to see what's happening now a little better. The silver has started to melt in the crucible, and the crucible has fallen down into the fire a little bit. I keep working new coat around it. Poking underneath the crucible every now and then to make sure it's not hollowed out. Make sure there's fuel under there. Are starting to get a little pool of silver in the bottom there. The spoons are beginning to descend. Much as anything, this is so Steve will know exactly how I made his bar of silver. You can think of this as pirate treasure from West Virginia. Alright, you see all those spoons have fallen down now into the crucible. Starting to get a nice little puddle of silver at the bottom. I will start adding more silver. Here's a whole pile of soup spoons. I get the whole stack. They sort of nest together so you can get quite a lot going in there at once. Yep. I'll just put the whole stack of soup spoons in there. But now that there's a puddle, it transmits the heat into the work, into the spoons much faster. They will melt at that little puddle. And I don't want a super hot fire, I just want it to be hot enough. It's not like you're working toward a forge weld here. The silver will melt below 2,000 degrees. There we go. Start seeing the spoons as they go down. I hope with that filter on the camera you can actually see into the fire. It's a little hard on cameras. There's all those soup spoons. I figured from the weight that there would be about 5 cubic inches of silver. So my mold is much larger than that. Everything should go in the mold. Very nice. I'm going to put some more spoons in. Here's big tablespoons. as the tablespoons slowly sink into the bottle. There they go. Melt, little spoons, melt. Again, you've got to be careful not to let the fire hollow out underneath the crucible. You want to make sure that stays nice and hot under there. Alright, I'm going to add just a little tiny bit of borax additionally. And I'm going to get the rest of my safety gear on. So I'm going to cover up all of that. I'm going to put my goggles on. Put my gloves on. Some people don't take these precautions, and they are the same people that have lots more scar tissue than I do. I have enough scar tissue, particularly from casting, to know to be careful. All right. So what I'm doing now is I'm generating a little extra heat so that it'll be nice and fluid and fill up the mold nicely without any pockets or voids. You can kind of tell that by the surface. If the surface inside the crucible looks nice and shiny, just has a tiny little glaze of flux, and you see things moving around, that is a nice temperature for silver. You don't need a lot. Oh yes, that looks very nice in there. Okay, let's see if there's a better angle, because I want you to be able to see this being poured. So this might be a better angle. Okay, I've moved the camera to what I think will be a better angle, and everything is pulling over to the edges of the crucible. Very good. All right, so I'm going to pick it up a little bit and grab it further down. You want to get a good grip on it, like that, and you're not really squeezing it. You don't want to break the crucible. It just sounds like pouring beer out of a bottle. Okay. Little bit left in the crucible, but not that much. Yeah. Now, your crucible can have thermal shock. If you just put it down on a fire brick or something, the crucible can break. So you want it to cool down slowly. You kind of put it back in the fire without any draft on it, and it'll come down in temperature a little bit. And in a little while you can pull it out and put it in some ashes or on a fire brick. So this is cast, and I'm going to take the filter off the camera. So there's the scene without the filter on the camera. Okay, so this is what it looks like without the filter on the camera. The mold and all is still pretty hot. I'm going to wait a little bit before I take it all apart. No need to be in a terrible hurry with one of these molds, because the ingot is still a little fragile. When it's that hot, the ingot itself is kind of brittle. Silver has strength at a dull red heat, but it's always good to kind of let it cool down. And then I'm going to quench it in water, because that actually helps soften silver to be quenched, unlike steel. All right, so there the ingot is. There the ingot is in the mold. You see the ingot in the mold. I dump it out. That is the ingot of silver that we just cast. I quenched it in the water. And that's the ingot. Less light, you might be able to see it. There it is. That's the ingot. I am going to stop and get my safety gear. All right, you can see a few tiny specks of silver that jumped out of the mold, not much. And there's this little flange, which is the silver that actually went through the bottom of the mold. So I'm going to take off the flange, and you save that. You do it over a piece of paper or a pan, and you can remelt that the next time. Just put it right in there, or send it off to be refined, or make silver solder out of it, or do all sorts of fun things. But the point is you don't want those little sharp flanges sticking out. And now, once I get all the little tiny specks off that, the sharp bits, so to speak, I'm going to cold forge this ingot, because what Steve wants is, instead of a 1-inch square, he wants something that's a little wider than an inch and about 1/4 of an inch thick, 3/16. Might make a couple different sizes, but I'm going to forge this cold under the trip hammer and make some different sizes. You can only reduce it about half its thickness, so what I'll end up with is something that's about 1/2 inch thick and about twice as long, and then I'll have to anneal it with a torch and forge it again to get it to the final size. There's my faithful 25-pound little giant. Okay, so I've reduced it down, maybe not as far as I thought, but enough that it felt stiff in the hammer, so maybe I should anneal it. Okay, to anneal this bar of silver, I'm going to coat it with a mixture of alcohol and borax, which will give it sort of a barrier to oxidizing. It's less likely to just turn black. I just rub this on. The alcohol will burn off, and a little bit of borax will help protect the silver. But you can get fire scaling on sterling. So just a tiny coating of borax on here, and a little bit on the ends. That'll help. And then, of course, being alcohol, I'm going to take it far away from the flame. Put that on the other side. To anneal silver, you just need to I've got to hand hammer that a little bit, consolidate the edges a bit. The geometry of this bar is just slightly diamond. It bounces around in the trip hammer, and it's gotten hard enough that I don't think it's safe to keep forging in the trip hammer until I get it straightened out a little bit. And it's very jumpy, which tells me it's still hard, so it needs to be annealed again. Yeah, that will probably do. Okay. Goes back to being annealed. Okay, going to anneal this using a rosebud tip on the acetylene torch. Oops. Okay, so like I said before, you anneal silver just like copper by quenching it while it's red hot. It makes all kinds of happy sounds. That little bit of borax helps keep it clean, because that's mostly what you're seeing there is the borax coating, which will rub right off. I'll forge right through that, because until I get to the finished dimension, it's more work taking the flux coating off than it's worth, because you have to reflux it again anyway, and most of it comes off when you're forging. Hammer. So after 6 cycles of annealing and hammering, we've got a silver bar that's a little bit more than an inch wide, a little bit more than 1/4 of an inch thick, and about 16 inches long. I've trimmed the ends to get rid of the little fuzzy piping parts. And what I'm going to do now is sand it lightly to take some of the minor surface defects off, before using the polished hammer on the smooth bench anvil to give it its final shape. So what you want to do is take enough of the surface defects off without removing a lot of material. And by surface defects, I mean tiny little bits of flux that might still be stuck on there. Sometimes you get tiny little pieces of grit stuck in the surface of the metal, because it is soft metal and we've been hammering on it cold. And even though I'm trying to use a clean anvil and a clean surface, things like in the trip hammer, you'd be amazed at the little bits and pieces of nothing that can cause a defect in a shiny surface, because that's the thing about silver is it's making a very shiny surface. And again, you shouldn't be nervous about working silver. It's valuable material, but it works pretty much like brass does in a number of ways. Sterling silver is harder than copper. And it'll work harden quite hard. That'll be a future video. I have some ideas to show you what you can do with hardened silver. But all I'm doing right now is taking a lot of the little surface defects and blemishes off, so that I'll have a nice clean surface. The silversmiths call it planishing. P-L-A-N-A-S-H-I-N-G. I don't know why. Maybe it's because you're kind of making a plane. But you use a polished hammer and a smooth anvil and go over the surface of the work to give it a nice surface finish. Even though this is Steve's bar of silver, and he says he's going to cut it up to make knife guards, it's still an excuse for me to show you some of the silversmithing techniques. If you're wondering, this is some 240 wet dry paper, and all this little bits of dust get her on the surface here. I will save that and melt it down too, because we're going to make some pin stock for Steve. This is the little cut off ends and little bits of filings from the fuzzies that have come off here, and that is maybe another ounce or so in there. That'll get melted down and made into pin stock for the knife handles. So anyway, that's about as far as I go. I'll wipe it down a little bit. I have silver plated hands now. Alright, there's the bar of silver. There's my little planishing anvil. There's my planishing hammer, which is just a very highly polished hammer. See, both ends are polished. And all you do is it helps to make sure you've got it tight in the vise first. So all I'm doing is making a smoother surface with a smoother hammer. And you do that all over the bar. It also is not a bad time to get the bar as straight as possible. So while I'm doing all this, I'm also straightening it out. I'm not bothering to make it exactly dimensional because he may need guards that are just a tiny bit wider or a tiny bit narrower. And again, its stock is going to be cut up. So I'm not really trying to make it perfectly dimensional. And you just continue on all along the bar.